Hello and welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Just finished up updating the NFL head coaching and coordinator cycle, and on that note, we're going to be moving on to the NBA, where we had, in my opinion, a very surprising move from one of the best teams in basketball in terms of their head coaching decision. Yesterday, the Bucks fired their first-year head coach, Adrian Griffin, after just 43 games, in which they went 30-13 during the stretch and were second in the Eastern Conference. It was clear that there was something going on behind the scenes, really, for a while. It really started during the Bucks in-season tournament loss against the Pacers, where there were some stories that came out. I think Chris Haynes had it first, that in the locker room afterwards, there were some words exchanged between Griffin and Bobby Portis. Griffin was getting on the team's case about rebounding and playing with more effort, sacrificing, and Bobby Portis also called out Adrian Griffin, saying that he needs to be better and actually coach them, especially later in games, on offense and do more. So an exchange of words then, and from there it seemed like Adrian Griffin had just lost the locker room. Giannis had some interesting moments throughout the course of the year where his body language was just off, and naturally when you have your star player unhappy, these are the things that tend to happen across the NBA. The Bucks were second in the league in offensive rating. Now, obviously, a lot of talent on that end of the ball, but they were 21st in defensive rating and not getting any better. And yes, you have maybe some lackluster guards to help contribute on that side of the ball between Damian Lillard and Malik Beasley. They had traded Grayson Allen to acquire Damian Lillard, which obviously an offensive upgrade. But you still looked at their defense, and Chris Middleton, we'll see. I think that he's had his moments, but he hasn't really been the vintage Chris Middleton that he was for the Bucks championship run a couple seasons ago. And when you have that much of a lackluster group defensively, it is obviously a tough task. Now, that being said, they do still have two defensive anchors, Giannis Antetokounmpo and Brook Lopez, who should be raising the floor of your defense. Brook Lopez has still been great this season. Giannis, I thought that he was maybe going to have a little bit more of an impact on that side of the ball, given the fact that Dame was coming in and could take some of the offensive load off of him. But all in all, they have just been a bad product on that side of the ball. And I think that that was some of the fans' gripes with this team. But ultimately, I think it comes down to that locker room. It sounds like from that loss on, the team really didn't have faith in him, and trying to continue on this run with a coach who hasn't proven anything. You are a championship expectation team. You did so a couple seasons ago. Yes, the group isn't exactly the same anymore, but that is what the guys in that locker room are thinking. We are playing for a championship here, and they just didn't really believe that he was the one who could get them to that. So then come today, there were reports last night by CNN and such, TNT, during the in-between time from the Nets and Knicks game and the Lakers and Clippers game. They were talking about how Doc Rivers was working his way to an agreement with the Milwaukee Bucks. ESPN picked it up today and officially declared the contract agreement. So Doc Rivers is now the head coach of the Milwaukee Bucks. Doc Rivers was just fired by the 76ers after last season the Sixers blew a 3-2 lead to the Boston Celtics, and he was let go. Was pretty good, I think, doing play-by-play and announcing on some of these national TV games for the season, but we're going to have to hold off on hearing more of him from the booth because he will be on the sideline in Milwaukee. So, in my opinion, I think that Doc Rivers was the best immediate answer. It's obviously the middle of the season. The halfway point just struck for most of, if not all, the teams within the past week, reaching game 41 of the 82-game season. So, I think that they put themselves in a bad position through the past year or so, and desperate times call for desperate measures. I like Doc Rivers, but it is very fair, I think, for people to have concerns with him based off of how the last few years of his coaching career have gone. And I think that just before we get into Doc Rivers himself, just sort of laying out the timeline here, because the Bucks decided to fire Mike Budenholzer coming off of the upset in the playoffs this year where they lost. They were the 1 seed and lost to the 8th seeded Miami Heat team. Now, I was never a huge fan of Mike Budenholzer. I don't know. I thought that he was very stubborn in some of his philosophies. The heavy drop coverage from Brook Lopez on defense as far as in the screen game, making sure Brook Lopez plays in the paint as opposed to coming up and contesting shooters. I thought that at times that hurt him and the team, but at the same time, he helped Brook Lopez, get national recognition for being an all defensive center for their team, and they won the championship in 2021. And when that happened, and I was still sort of concerned with Budenholzer, I'm like, okay, well, you know what? He just got himself another 10 years of a leash here, because I think that up to that point, that was the point in time where Giannis had a couple MVPs, but not much playoff success. Budenholzer maybe had a coach of the year at that point with Milwaukee, but again, hadn't gotten over the hump yet. And I thought that in 2021, if they didn't win, that could be Budenholzer's last year. But then they go on to win it. And I thought that, things were going to go forward like this, but they were not. Now, if you look back to last season in their loss to the Heat, you can call it an embarrassment, but obviously Giannis missed the majority of that series, and the Miami Heat ended up going to the finals. So I don't think that it's quite as embarrassing as people may make it out to be. Yes, the 1 versus 8 never looks good, but it's hard to do when your star player misses most of that series and the team that you're playing wasn't a real 8 seed. Like, yes, they almost lost to the Bulls, interestingly enough. Nobody ever talks about that. The fact that they almost didn't make the playoffs in general because they were trailing the Bulls in the play-in tournament, but end up coming back there and then making the run all the way to the finals. So I think that it's not that bad of a look for Budenholzer himself. I don't know how much more he could have done. Chris Middleton, he's made steps this season, but even last year he was even less of himself, and it was asking an older Drew Holiday to be the offensive and defensive anchor on the perimeter. I don't think that the circumstances were great there for them, and I didn't really agree with the decision to fire him then. I think it gets even more interesting when you consider the timeline of the fact that at that time they didn't know that they were going to have the chance even to trade for Damian Lillard. And looking back at it, I don't know if they would have fired him if they knew they were getting Dame, because Dame is now in his 30s on a very expensive contract, and I think that when you make that sort of a trade, you're doing so for one reason mostly one reason, to win a championship. I think it was also to show Giannis that they were committed to him long term. But I think that was the initial idea of moving off of Budenholzer and finding a coach that Giannis liked, was we want to make our star player happy for the time to come. And in that process, they made some questionable moves, in my opinion. And it's hard, again, especially in the NBA, where this is such a players-driven league, to openly go against your star player. But reports in the past 24 hours have come out that Nick Nurse, who was with the Raptors when they won the finals in 2019, he was almost the creator of the wall type defense that has tried to be replicated. There's no fully stopping Giannis, but the wall idea came from that finals run by Nick Nurse and the Raptors in that postseason run that sort of stuck around with Giannis for, again, nobody's stopping this guy, but the best defense almost possible to guard him was generated from Nick Nurse. Now, I'm not sure why, but Giannis was reportedly did not want to play for Nick Nurse. He made that very clear in the offseason, despite Nick Nurse being a finalist for the position based off of people in the front office wanting him. But when they heard that Giannis did not want to play for him, they cast him aside. He ends up signing with the Philadelphia 76ers, and we've seen the success that the Sixers have had this season. Now, they've always been a good regular season team these past handful of years, but you get the point. I think that Nick Nurse is a very good coach in the league, and it's hard to say they made the mistake by not hiring him based off of the fact that Giannis would have been upset if they did, because that's just what the NBA is right now. But if you know you're not going to be able to hire, and maybe this is unfair of me to say, but if you know you're not going to be able to hire the best coach available on the market because of any factor, this one being that Giannis didn't want to play for him, why let go of the good coach you already have? I don't think Budenholzer was great, but I thought he was good enough. He showed that he was good enough, and they end up firing him and bringing in Adrian Griffin, who was more so Giannis's pick, and it seems like they're hurt as a result of this. And that brings us to yesterday, where 43 games into the season, they don't have a head coach anymore. So again, I think that Doc was the best solution available to them at that time. Doc Rivers is a very historic coach. He won the finals in 2008 with the Celtics. He's won a Coach of the Year award in the past. But there's also a little bit of negative history that follows him. He's blown 3-1 leads. He's 6-10 as a head coach in Game 7s, and he's lost the last 5 of which. One of them came last year after blowing a 3-2 lead against the Celtics. So there's just a lot of baggage, a lot of different ways to look at the way that this is all played out. And I think it's going to be tough for him to get acclimated with this team already halfway through the year. But at least it's not like they have a lot of room in the standings to make up for. They are the number 2 seed. They're just a few games out from the number 1 seeded Boston Celtics. So it's not like they have to fully rediscover themselves and figure out new philosophies to work. That offense is baseline very good. Defense is going to need work. And I think that they might need work from outside of the organization. They might have to make a trade. I don't know. I think that after finding out all of this news and such, I don't think I'd have them in the top 2, teams in the Eastern Conference, I would have the Celtics above them, and I would have the Miami Heat above them. And I think it's also, if you want to assume that Joel Embiid is fully healthy, I also think that them and the Sixers are, just neck and neck. The top of the East is very loaded. So it's going to be difficult to try and reimagine themselves on the fly like this going into the playoffs. But we'll see. Doc Rivers has done so before. So we will just have to be continuing to monitor the situation. So that's all we have on the Bucks. We're going to be sticking in the NBA and talking about the Los Angeles Lakers on the other side of the break. So stick with us.